I'll let people in from the waiting room so you can kick it off whenever you're ready, Corwin.
Okay.
And
All
I
right.
can
Give
keep
me
an eye on
just a
that.
second here.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Let's go ahead and get started here. Want to say good afternoon. I'm Corwin Nicholson. For those who don't know who I am, I'm your producer moderator for Tech in 30. So welcome to our this latest webinar. We hadn't had one of these since last fall. Sometime I can't remember the date. But just to kick this off, Tech in 30. This is FIOPSI USA's platform for prop tech news and information sharing, focused specifically on technologies and their companies in the prop tech space. We have another exciting webinar titled Tech Trends in Large Multifamily Housing Portfolios, and it's going to be presented by Mr. Donald Davidoff, who you will hear from in just a few more minutes. So you know the format for Tech in 30 is generally a 30, 35-minute, maybe 40-minute discussion on the topic, and followed by, say, up to, say, a 15-minute Q&A session. So that's the format there. Let's see. So we don't see even our presidents online. So no, kickoff information from them. Hopefully they'll join us soon. And yeah, I want to say thank you for everyone's attendance. Thank you for Mr. Donald Davidoff of REBA. I think which stands for Real Estate Business Analytics. And
That's
so
exactly right. Yep.
Okay, gotcha. So I found Reba on some of my prop tech news source from, I think it was CRE Tech, and you guys are doing some amazing things, and so that's what that prompted me to reach out to Donald, and that's why he's here now to give us this exciting topic on multifamily portfolios. So without further ado, I will hand it off to Donald Davidoff. And Donald, you have the floor.
Excellent. Thank you. Let me just get the screen share here. So I do not have a fancy presentation. It's really going to be more of a conversation than anything else. But here we go. We'll get this going. So thanks, Corin, for inviting me. As he said, I'm Donald Davidoff, co-founder and CEO of Real Estate Business Analytics, or REBA. We're a data insights platform for rental housing. So a BI platform as a service solution, a budget and forecasting application, and coming soon a pricing and revenue management application. I'll touch on those areas a little bit, but this is obviously not meant to be commercial for us. It's more a general conversation around tech trends that large multifamily housing companies are seeing today. Just by way of background, I got into the industry through building pricing and revenue management software. I worked at a software company that did that, and led the team that built LRO way back in 1999 and 2000. In 2001, switched sides of the table and became the industry's first ever vice president of pricing and revenue management for a company called Archstone, publicly traded REIT. Later part of the S&P 500, later taken private by Tishman Speyer and Lehman Brothers at exactly the wrong time in 2007, 2008. And I stayed there through 2011. I spent a year in senior living and then consulted for a number of years before co-founding REBA. So a lot of what I'm going to draw on today is from that REIT experience, the large REIT experience, and then also from the consulting work that's gone on. So I really just have one slide, and in 30 minutes we're just going to do a whirlwind tour of all the different things that I'm seeing going on in multifamily prop tech. And as Corbin said at the end, I've got plenty of time for Q&A should there be any. So number one on the hit parade is centralization. That was a growing trend even back pre-COVID. I think the kind of technology that got accelerated through COVID has made this even more interesting. And I'm particularly fascinated by the whole centralization topic, in that I mean, I remember my entire time at Archstone from 2001 through 2011. We always basically had one front of the house person for every 100 homes, and one, service person for every 100 homes. And so, no matter how you tried to make things more profitable, more profitable tend to come from scale, larger properties, more concentration geographically, so you got a better understanding of the markets, and it was all top line growth. Through centralization activities, now you can actually crack that one for 100 staffing. It's also interesting because before I joined Archstone, back in the late 90s, they tried to regionalize a number of operations, and it was a dismal failure. And the reason it was a failure was not because the idea was bad, but because the technology wasn't there to support it. Right? That was early internet days. A lot of places were still doing dial-up modems, for those of you old enough as I am to remember that. So that was an idea before its time, and now the time's clearly here. Companies like Avalon Bay have led the way, but many companies are looking at that. I would draw your attention, if this is particularly interesting to you, I would draw your attention to a recent study that came out, the 20 for 20 research paper that Dominic Beveridge puts out. You can probably Google and find it. If not, shoot me an email and I'll find the website for you. But he really focused on this topic this year. He interviewed 20 executives, 10 tech execs and 10 operating execs across a wide range of types of portfolios, and really got a lot of information there. I'll just give you a couple of highlights because this is such a hot topic now. And it's really fascinating to me because there's 3 areas that you could centralize. There's leasing, administration, and service. And, if you think about the staffing challenges, particularly around maintenance and service these days, I would argue that the most value would come from regionalizing and centralizing maintenance operations, right? Both the receipt and the dispatching of service tickets, and also the sharing of resources across multiple properties within a submarket or within a market. I think that argument's pretty solid, but as a matter of practicality, that's where the least activity is going on right now. I have a feeling, but my own supposition is a lot of that has to do with sort of dispatching software and understanding maintenance tech skills and applying those over a schedule across multiple geographies. It's not something that's been a core competency of the industry. And you can handle administrative and leasing tasks without dispatching people, right? So I think the physicality of service is what's inhibiting that a little bit, even though I think the payoff would be very, very large. The most activities occurring on the other two. I will also say, I wonder, I was talking with Dom and I was just speculating, he didn't have it as part of his interviews, but I'm also wondering if, since most of the senior execs, most of the COOs in multifamily housing come from the front of the house side, not too many come from the service side, if there's also just more of a comfort with that process. And so, centralizing those tasks just feels less risky. So I don't know, that's speculation, but I'll share that for what it's worth. The administration side, that's basically a number of companies being on a mission to get rid of the assistant community manager, right? The bookkeeping, the on-site bookkeeping, that is, the chasing of rents when rents are overdue, those kinds of activities. There's really no reason in 2023 that has to be on site. And in fact, I remember even back when I first started in the industry, right, in that 1999 to 2001 timeframe, I always thought it was odd. We have leasing agents who are good salespeople, and we want to advance their career, so we promote them to become assistant community managers. And then from there, they can hopefully be promoted to become community managers and from their regionals and on up. And I always thought that was a lot because the assistant community manager position is, completely different than a leasing or even a community management position, right? It's focused on administrative tasks, on bookkeeping and chasing payments and all that sort of stuff. And I don't know about your experience, but I don't find too many people who are great salespeople and also really high level attention to detail, administrators. Like the skill sets tend to be orthogonal. And so I always thought it was odd that we take people out of sort of what they're best at, and in order to advance them, we put them into a position that they're probably not as good at, in the hopes that they'll manage to muddle through and eventually make it to be a community manager. So I think a lot of the movement on the administrative side is a recognition that it's not a particularly good part of the career path, and it's something that's very easily regionalized or even centralized at headquarters. The real activity that's newer is around leasing, and a lot of that has come out of the the advances in technology through the pandemic period, particularly around self-showing and self-touring. So we'll talk a little bit about self-show later on. One of the things I'll sort of highlight at this point is when you look at this list, they're not 100% discrete elements, right? If you did a Venn diagram, there's a lot of overlap, right? Part of what enables self-show is, part of what enables centralization is self-show. The fact that we've had centralized pricing for a long, long time now, well, that already enables it, et cetera. So think of it more as sort of interlinked concepts that can be reinforcing each other. And I think you'll have a better idea of what's going on with technology. So that's kind of hitting the highlights on centralization. Pricing is a very interesting area right now. It got more interesting about 4 or 5 months ago. I would tell you, as someone who got into the industry on pricing, it's always been interesting to me. But ever since, so pricing had an interesting history. There was a lot of pushing against Jello before it broke. So to give you an idea of the history, we started piloting LRO at Archstone in early 2001. By late 2001, we decided to roll it out. The next company using revenue management, or at least using LRO, was Simpson in 2003. Somewhere around 2003 or 4 is when Camden, I think, was the first property on YieldStar. These are the two leading, automated pricing software solutions out there. By 2006, by middle of 2006, there were maybe a half a dozen using LRO, maybe close to the same number, not quite, using YieldStar. Between 2006 and I want to say 2008, 2009, pretty much every NMHC top 50 adopted revenue management of one form or the other. In fact, one of the seminal events was Green Street Advisors coming out with a report that of the 8 publicly traded REITs they were tracking, BRE had been number 8 out of 8 in revenue growth for 8 quarters in a row. And they couldn't help but note that they were the only ones still manually pricing. All other 7 were using either LRO or YieldStar. And that got BRE to move pretty quickly to adopt revenue management. And I think that was also a turning point in the industry's adoption. So by 2009, it's pretty de rigueur. And then frankly, it's been mostly a desert ever since. Rainmaker enhanced their lease expiration management about 6-7 years ago, a little bit before they got acquired by RealPage. RealPage has released what they call AIRM. Even though this is being recorded, I will say candidly, that's more marketing fluff. There's not a lot of AI other than in name. It is an advancement on YieldStar. It's really YieldStar 2.0, which they deserve credit for. It's absolutely an improvement on the original YieldStar. But basically, that means in about 15 to 20 years, there's been one material enhancement in each of the leading softwares. The rest of any enhancements were more, nibbling at the reporting or the dashboarding, or, it wasn't at the core model. So the industry is definitely very ripe for some new pricing and revenue management solutions. We're certainly jumping on that at REBA. And I alluded to things got really interesting about 4-ish months ago. You may already be aware of this. If you're not, ProPublica came out with an article that was questioning whether, in particular, YieldStar with its use of non-public information namely actual lease data, if that was creating a collusive environment. And within days, the first of several class action antitrust lawsuits or price collusion lawsuits were filed. So that is something to pay attention to. I think that RealPage has a pretty good argument that it's not collusive. Nevertheless, even with a good argument, you can still be sued. And, there's a lot of attention that's going to be, placed on how that evolves. The exposure is very, very large if they were found guilty at trial. So I think it's going to take a while for that to work itself out. It'll almost certainly settle. I mean, those kinds of lawsuits rarely end in pure dismissal or actual trial. But I am neither a lawyer nor am I privy to any of RealPage's strategy on that. So take what I say with that with a grain of salt. But it did make pricing suddenly become very, very interesting. Okay, moving on to the third one on the list, data and business intelligence. It's very interesting. When I left senior living in late 2011, I'm sorry, it was late 2011, I believe. Maybe it was 2012. I thought about starting a software company, and at the time, I just thought the industry wasn't ready for it. It would just be too heavy a lift, too long a slog, which is why I got into consulting. Fast forward to 2019, and that's when we founded Reba, and the whole play is around data insights, particularly better use of first-party data, that is your own data on leasing, on rents, on service requests, on make-readies, on asset management, on development, you name it. There's so much data that companies generate themselves. And up until Reba, you pretty much were stuck in Excel hell. The PMSs had some what they called BI solutions, but they were pretty limited. Absolutely better than just Excel. Definitely deserves some credit there. But fairly constrained, fairly limited, to be honest. Or you had to spend $2 to $3 million in 2 to 3 years just to build a V1 of a bespoke BI platform. And in fact, my co-founder and I did a number of those at Archstone, at Avalon Bay, at Riverend Apartments, Progress Residential, places like that. So only the biggest guys willing to invest had good data platforms. And I think today you're seeing many, many more. We're 3.25 years old. We're up to 25 customers already. So a lot of activity happening there. And again, I'll refer you back to that 20 for 20 white paper or research paper that I mentioned. There's a whole section on data and business intelligence that I think is really interesting. Industries prosper better when data can flow like water, when you can get access to data and use it much more quickly. I think there's still some barriers to that in multifamily, but those barriers are slowly coming down. And organizations like ours and some that we compete with are really helping make that possible. I will say, as an aside on the data and business intelligence side, it's an interesting observations I've seen about this. The first is it's always been very hard to convince a COO where the money is in investing in BI, right? They know they're going to write a check. How do I get the return? Where's the IRR? Yeah, I hear you say better decisions faster. I don't know. That sounds intangible. That's kind of fluffy. I don't know what that means. So I'll tell you, my entire career in BI, it's been very hard to convince a senior exec who's never had good BI the value of it. But bit by bit, it's happened despite that. And what's very interesting is I know several CEOs or COOs who ultimately had a decent BI platform, who then left and went to a new company in a CEO or COO position. And that company did not have BI. And all of a sudden, building BI or choosing a BI solution was number 1 or number 2 on their list immediately. Because once you've had it, if you go someplace where you don't have it, you literally feel like you're driving a car blind. Like you just can't see. There's a reason they call these visualizations dashboards, right? It's all of a sudden I don't have a dashboard. I'm supposed to drive a car and I don't know what's going on. So I think that's really, really interesting. The other thing, and this was covered in one of those 20 for 20 papers a couple of years ago, is most software in this industry is like the adoption cycle is like I explained in pricing, right? It took 6 years to go from 1 to 6 LRO customers. And then within 3 years, there were 50, 80, 100, right? So it's sort of push against Jello, push against Jello, push against Jello. And then some critical mass gets reached and it just takes off. You see the same thing in self-show. Prior to the pandemic, not just no, but hell no was what we heard from a lot of operators. Talk more about that in a moment. But then all of a sudden, granted, catalyzed by the pandemic, but I think it would have happened somewhat this way anyway. All of a sudden, there was a critical mass and everybody was doing, or at least most people were doing some form of self-show or at least optionality to it. But the business intelligence side, if you actually look at the history of its growth in this industry, it's just been more like the turtle in The Turtle and the Hare, just slow, steady, a little bit more each year, a little bit more each year, a little bit more each year. It's been a very, very different adoption cycle than all the rest of the technology that I've seen. Fourth on the list, near and dear to my heart, because we do have a budget solution ourselves. I still find it fascinating. Recent study by 111 Advisors, I think it's 70% of real estate management companies of all sizes, of 5,000 units and up, so up into the tens of thousands of units. 70% of those companies are using Excel for their property level budgeting. If you've got a small portfolio, a few properties, okay, probably Excel works fine. But as soon as you get upwards of 20, 30, 40 or more, Excel is not an enterprise solution. So I've been fascinated that this industry uses Excel more often than not, more often than all other solutions combined. I think you're going to see that change over the next few years. We have a couple competitors in the space now, and we're getting traction also. There's so much more you can do when it's an application built on top of a database, just in terms of aggregating data, making it quicker for people to do their budgets. So, I'm always amused. Budget season is usually in the fall when, it's a very challenging time, right? We're moving from high season to low season. And for 2 months, we put our head to the CEO and our rear end to the customer digging into budgets. So if we can make budgets take less time, fewer hours, we can spend more time with residents, with prospects, et cetera. So I see a lot happening there. The other thing about Excel as an enterprise solution is it's very easy for people to stomp on cells. I've people who've heard me present on this before have heard me say this. If I have a superpower, one of mine is I'm that guy who can look at an Excel sheet and in 5 or 10 seconds tell you what cell just has to be wrong. It's just the way my brain works. I see the simple math quickly. And I remember once back at Archstone, I saw a rent per square foot that could not be right. Like there was the rent, there was a square footage right next to it, rent per square foot. That couldn't be right. Sure enough, somebody had stomped on the cell, and instead of C4 divided by B4, it just was $1.54. Somebody had hard entered. And being curious as I was, I wondered, well, how long in the past was the rent for that unit type $1.54 per square foot? The answer turned out to be 3 years. So for 3 years, that Excel sheet had $1.54 for the A1s just hardwired, and nobody noticed. Makes you wonder how important it was to have that information. And if it was at all important, they were using the wrong information for 3 years. So that's another reason why you want things like budgets in an application, in a protected database, not in an Excel sheet. Okay, I'll get off my high horse on that one. Smart home, IoT, this was all the rage about 4 years ago. It's still a big deal. I mean, the thing that I always find interesting about smart home is it's got a lot of possibilities. There's a lot of sexiness, especially in the A-class buildings. I mean, you don't build an A-class high-rise without smart home tech. At the same time, because it's physical, it's expensive. It takes a lot of energy to get it in. So it can be de rigueur on developments, but penciling out when I'm supposed to keep my year-over-year expense growth to 2 or 3%, penciling out a retrofit on an existing building is a lot harder. Now I've done some research and back in my consulting days, co-authored a white paper that actually showed there is ROI in doing that. But I can understand the industry's reticence around it, or at least the slower adoption rate. And also one of the things that I think has really gotten in the way of smart home adoption is just the vast numbers of different vendors out there. And so there's a little bit of vendor fatigue, and you don't want to pick a vendor, install a bunch of hardware, and a year or two later they're out of business, right? Or even sold, and now they're using a different standard. So I think, again, I think that's something that has sort of an inevitable, inexorable rise to it. But there's a lot of choices still to be made. A lot of different strengths and weaknesses around the different options out there. So I think you're going to continue to see an awful lot of action there. Also, getting data out of the home and getting into the home, is very sexy from a prop tech perspective. So I think you're going to continue to see a lot of money coming in to new and existing ideas there. So that's a brief review of the smart home IoT world. Self show I mentioned earlier, it was hilarious. In 2019, that same 20 for 20 paper, I was involved in creating that paper. Dom and I were working together back then. He now has it on his own. But he and I did that together, and I had been involved in a lot of SFR work. So a little bit of overlap with the second to last item, lessons from single family rentals. The single family rental world really had no choice but to adopt self-show because it was just too expensive and too logistically challenging to have leasing agents, drive and get to each individual home. So in this context, I'm talking about single family rentals as scattered homes, right? For those of you, in case you're not familiar with some of the lingo or the lexicon, single family rental really has two parts. There's the build to rent world, which we'll talk about later. But the build to rent world is I'm going to build a community of single family homes, kind of like horizontal multifamily. And then there's the scattered homes, which is where the professional SFR work coming out of the Great Recession started. So when BlackRock made their big bet, which became Invitation Homes, Credium, Don Mullen, who made his initial fortune on The Big Short at Goldman Sachs, then put that money to use building what is now a 70 or 100,000 home portfolio with Progress Residential owned by Pretium Partners. Those guys, they had no choice but to do this. And I remember we interviewed 20 people and asked them about plans on self-show in 2019. This was late 2019, November. And 19 out of 20 had no plans. Some of them were not just no, but hell no. And of course, we all know what happened in March of 2020. So I do think eventually it would have come around. But if the pandemic accelerated one technology more than any other, it was self-show. And again, self-show runs the gamut. I mean, you can do self-show with, essentially no tech, right? Somebody could come to an office and just be given the keys, almost like the way you test drive a car. Give me your driver's license, so I know you'll bring the key back. Here's the key. Here's a little map. Go see what you want to see. It can be all the way to the other extreme, like a Tour 24, where it's almost a museum-like curated thing. And then there's a lot in between, the Rentleys of the world and Anyone Homes product and several others. So I do think self-show is obviously here to stay. I think optionality is the key. Some prospects want self-show, some don't. I know for myself, if I was looking for an apartment, I actually find salespeople annoying, right? I don't really want them watching over my shoulder. I'd much rather go at my own pace, look at my own stuff. My wife and I don't have to play the "well, let them know you like something" game, all that kind of stuff. So there's always going to be people like me, and there's going to be other people who want that. I will tell you, studies done in the single family world showed that there was absolutely no decline in closing rate from self-show versus not, which, that introduces some interesting questions about what value are leasing associates adding if they're not closing more than self-shows close, and maybe a little more retrospection around how do we help our leasing associates be better at their job, maybe one of the things that comes out of that. Okay, up until now, I've talked a lot about things that are sort of, either front of house, or in the case of budgeting and pricing, actually even business intelligence, back of house technology, but they're all very, very operationally driven. The next couple or three get very sort of tech wonky. So managed internet, this is, instead of signing some triple V contract or whatever, this is, having a preferred vendor that the residents can sign up with. This is actually the operator essentially buying bulk internet and installing the equipment necessary to deliver the internet on site. And then residents either can opt in, or it could be an automatic, either bundled or unbundled charge, right? Different models for actually how you implement it or how you monetize it. But the idea is that the operator becomes the internet provider. And this, again, in that Venn diagram I talked about earlier, overlaps with things like smart home tech, because smart home tech can be pretty bandwidth intense, right? In order to work well. And so if you want to make that work, sometimes having managed internet makes the most sense. So I've got some big pipes that I own, so my smart home tech can use it. And then once I've invested in that, well, I might as well turn around and resell some of that bandwidth to residents, and actually get some ancillary revenue off of that. Interesting implications for the REITs out there, because in REIT land, you can only have, only a certain percentage of quote unquote bad revenue, meaning revenue that's not rent. So, the financial engineering around REITs gets a little interesting with that, but the whole concept of managed internet makes a lot of sense. EV charging, again, it's very, very sub-market specific and even building type specific. Your garages at high rises and urban corridors are absolutely going to have some number of EV charging stations. If you've got A-class properties in Orange County, you're retrofitting some of the parking spots for that. You're figuring that out. At the same time, much like smart home, there's a lot of physicality to it, which comes with cost and risk. And there's a lot of different providers. So you're back in I don't want to install something that's not going to be supported 2 years from now. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And of course, it's very much tied also to the growth of electric cars. It's so obvious as to be trite to say that will keep growing. Like, you're not going to be able to ignore that forever, even if you're running a garden community in the suburbs. But it's still, the pace at which the nation's infrastructure, both from an automobile production perspective and from a charging station perspective, kind of inhibits some of that growth, or at least, causes the growth to be a little more linear and not quite so hockey stick, if you will. But the more towards the A-class and the more towards the urban or high-end suburban locations, the more you already have to do something about that. The next one, it gets particularly tech wonky, but you can't avoid it. And this one's interesting because most CEOs and most COOs neither understand nor do they want to understand. Acronyms like GDPR and PII and cyber. Cyber's not an acronym, but the whole cybersecurity stuff. I mean, they're deal people, or they're service and human resources development people in terms of building operating teams. All this stuff around data and data protection is really not what got them to the C-suite. So my advice is find a CTO, a CIO, a head of data security who really does revel in that kind of stuff, understands it, has the discipline. If you don't have, I had a friend once who was a big motorcycle buff, and he said there's only two kinds of people. There's only two kinds of motorcycle riders: those who've fallen and those who will fall. Because the idea that you ride motorcycles for 40 years of your life and you never put the bike down, like, that's just not going to happen. Okay. It's the same thing with cyber, right? There are people who haven't been hacked yet and people who will be hacked. The notion that we're going to avoid that, you do everything you can, but to me, it's not that it's less about. It absolutely is about protecting yourself, and it's about resilience, right? How do we detect that something has happened? How do we respond quickly to minimize the damage? How do we have layered insurance protections? What are the terms we have with every single one of our vendors, right? Not just that they're SOC 2 compliance, but I want to see their penetration test report. I want to, right? This is not something a COO or a CEO should be doing every day in a large, prop tech, in a large multifamily housing company. So you want to have somebody doing that for you. it's just, if you don't, it's the kind of thing that can cost your career. So you have to pay attention to it. You have to learn a little bit, but then you have to find a partner in that who you're really going to rely on. And they'll take care of PII. GDPR is the General Data Protection Rights. That's a European law. But basically, industry in general is just settling on GDPR is a higher standard than anything in the US. But if you have anybody from Europe ever looking at your data, you have to deal with it. So you might as well just do that. I will tell you, running a vendor shop, we care a lot about GDPR and about PII. And in fact, what we do as a data platform is we don't ingest PII in most cases, other than maybe the resident name and we have their address. In fact, it was funny, I was talking with Scott Petchersky, who's the CIO for RPM, Roscoe, the other day. And he was saying, yeah, like even where they have PII, they work very hard to store it only where it needs to be. So it needs to be in the property management system. It doesn't need to be in their bespoke BI platform. So, they don't want to store it in 3, 4, 5 places. That's 3 or 4 or 5 places that could get hacked, right? If they store it just where it's needed in the system of record and nowhere else, you don't eliminate, but you reduce the possibility of damage should you get hacked. So a lot of activity around that. Gets very legalistic. It's very technical. None of it is fun to the CEOs and COOs out there, but you got to pay attention. Risk management and asset protection. I'm thinking now like the Leonardo 24/7s, the Happy Co's of the world, right? Folks out there where software where you're doing due diligence all the way through maintaining your assets. So, imagine that I go in for a due diligence and I not only record the state of everything, but I'm actually recording serial numbers of the refrigerators and the stoves and all that. And then I maintain that through my maintenance programs and replacement programs. And then when I'm ready to sell, I can turn that over. There's actually value to the buyer in having that. So there's a lot of technology around helping with loss prevention, asset protection, et cetera. And I know we wanted to keep this to about a half an hour and then Q&A. So I'll ask for your indulgence in just a couple extra minutes on the presentation. Deposit alternatives is another area that's got a lot of different innovation around it. There are some people trying to get rid of security deposits. There's other people, like there's a new company out there, Roost. Full disclosure, I'm a minor investor in that, very small amount of money, but I'm intrigued by their idea. What Roost does is they basically say, look, security deposits aren't going away, but why are they managed the old way? And it takes 2 or 3 people at a large company to manage it. Why don't we just get it all into a database and let the technology platform handle all of the information, the data exchange? And oh, by the way, what if we make security deposits a financial instrument for the resident? So you wouldn't want to do this as an operator because getting all of the bank approvals and everything else juice isn't worth the squeeze for you. But if I'm going to have multiple customers and hopefully maybe millions of units, what if the security deposit was something that the resident could borrow against? Right? That's interesting. Now I don't need to maintain a staff to handle security deposits because the tech platform does it for me. It's all done online. And I can represent to the resident, hey, when you have to put that first and last months or whatever the deposit requirement is, if you ever need access to it, you could borrow against it at a reasonable, interest rate. And that money's not just completely shoved to the side. I think that's really interesting. And then there's all the other ones out there around deposit alternatives or deposit insurance or deposit protection, fintech solutions around, the big one built is a huge one out there with credit card, credit card services where they're not taking the normal 3%. That's a huge opportunity for operators and a value to residents. Lots and lots of different things there. Artificial intelligence gets a lot of energy and a lot of hype. I will tell you, I'm a little more of okay, where is the tool the right idea? And maybe we're not. So where is the tool the right idea? Certainly the chat bots, the things that help with leasing and are now moving into even handling service requests. Big opportunity. Vendors like Elise AI Leasehawk, etc. When you start getting to the data or the pricing side, color me a little more of a cynic. Machine learning needs lots and lots of data. Okay, terabytes, even petabytes. We're in a gigabyte world in multifamily, so there's a lot of chatter about AI and pricing, or AI in some of these other areas. I think there's some limitations to that. I personally had an experience with a single family rental client where we just wanted to use AI to capture and assess the quality of the assets. So again, scattered homes all over the place. They were bought willy-nilly, didn't even have good records of what was in there. Is the refrigerator black or white? Is it in good condition or not? 20,000 photos, we could still only get 70% accuracy on the color of the appliances. And one of the big problems was if there was a window or a flash shining on a black appliance, the reflection made the AI think it was white. Right? If you want to see another example of the problems with AI, even reading photos, and again, it gets better every year. But if you want to have some fun, Google puppies or bagels. Okay, just Google puppies or bagels, and you'll see a hilarious image that gives you an idea of sort of like humans are much better at discerning things from pictures than computers are, even today. I'll finish up lessons from SFR. SFR was behind multifamily for a while because it was started from scratch, again, back in 2008, 2009. And for a while, I think multifamily execs kind of looked down, sort of snubbed their nose at SFR because, it was sort of the hick cousin, if you will, right? The backwards stepchild of rental housing. But I'm telling you, they passed multifamily in some places, right? In 2009, the hubris that multifamily was uninterested in self-show, and it took a worldwide pandemic to break them of that. Whereas, the single family guys had figured something out. I think there's other places that could be interesting. Single family, scattered home, single family, they do not send a porter or a service tech to a home to replace a light bulb or unclog a toilet or whatever. Right? They give them the materials. They, have videos online, but single family home rental residents accept a lot more self-help. Be interesting if that becomes sort of the next thing that multifamily does to improve its margins, is get a little more of a balance, or not. I think what we could see is maybe a continuum of services and price points, depending on what is expected of the resident. And the last one, ESG. ESG, again, a lot of chatter, really high on the Gartner hype cycle. I think the E part of ESG is alive and well, not because companies are being forced to do ESG, but because if I can get a 30% return by doing something on energy, I should do a 30% return whether or not there's ESG pressure. I think it's really hard to measure the S&G. There's a lot of blogs on about that. So I won't belabor that point, other than to say the larger the company, the larger the operator, the more they're getting pressure from their owners and from the government. The smaller the company, the more they're kind of being left alone, and they'll follow in the footsteps eventually. And certainly, publicly traded companies and very large private ones at least have to pay some lip service to it. But I'm telling you, if you read most ESG reports, the E part, you're like, well, they should do that anyway because it's just good business. There's a good ROI. And the S and the G is more aspirational, more fluff than anything that I believe is really measurable. So until there can be some benchmarks that really make sense, I think it'll still be sort of this dichotomy of the big guys just have to do it the same way a publicly traded company has to do, certain things to qualify and to do all of that kind of stuff. I would like to, from a sort of point of personal privilege, I'd like to see, more equity and more, more sustainability. But it's hard to reconcile with capitalism unless you've got a really measurable rubric. And over time that will happen. But much like even Energy Star ratings, that's going to happen over a decade or two, not over a couple of years. So the big guys have to pay attention to it. I think other people ought to stay aware. But candidly, I don't see this as something that's going to get a lot of traction in the next year or two on small to mid-sized enterprises. Okay, I'm going to stop there and open up for the last 10 or 15 minutes for any Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Don. I appreciate that. This has been very insightful, folks. So, like you say, yeah, if people have questions, please make your intention known.
And I recognize that was a whirlwind tour.
But it was great. It was great.
40 minutes for everything happening in large MFH prop tech was a bit of a challenge.
I feel so much knowledgeable now.
Thank you, Donald, for your presentation. This is Shirley. I have a question on EV charging.
Yeah.
A lot of places I look at, they might have a few EV chargers. And if you're going to really have a tenant base that a lot of them have adopted electric vehicles.
Yeah.
I see a problem with that.
Yeah.
If I get in at 3 PM and I put my car on the charger, do I have to go down at 7 to move it so someone else can use it when it cuts off automatically? What are your thoughts or an opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed a big part of the challenge, right? I mean, I think that EV charging is going to go through kind of 2 phases, and it'll happen at different times in different even micro markets, certainly in different sub-markets. The first is there's got to be enough cars for me to even bother putting it in, right? Whether I'm paying for it and then getting some revenue, or whether a vendor is going to pay for it and just do a smaller revenue share with me, somebody's paying the physical money, to put those in. So you first have to have a site that has at least enough to be worth putting in, the 3 or 4 or 5 chargers, the way you mentioned, Shirley. Then what happens and what's my plan as, oh my God, all of a sudden, if 25% or 50% of my residents now have, electric vehicles, I need 30, 40, 50, I need 100. Like I'm going to need a lot. And so I think, not only is that a hard business situation to sort of plan out, I would be nervous that at some point in the not too distant future, it may already be happening in certain markets, the materials and the people who build and install those stations, right? Like how fast can they put them in? So I can easily tell you what the world's going to look like 30 years from now on that, right? They're going to be ubiquitous. Right now, they're fairly limited. I think that transition is going to be incredibly bumpy. And I think all I'm doing is explaining the problem you brought up in more detail. I don't pretend to have an answer for that. And I think, early adopters in places like Orange County or maybe some suburbs of DC and New York, places where, EVs are going to, rise in market share the fastest, right? We'll sort of watch those guys stumble on how they do it. And then everybody else will try to learn lessons from that and follow it. But I think EV stations can only grow at a certain pace as fast as the industry can tool up to build the machines themselves and train people and hire people to go install them. I hope that helped a little bit. I know that was a less than complete answer, but that's because I just don't have a good crystal ball on that.
Yeah, and I kind of feel like it's a chicken and egg thing because
yes,
I have one in my garage and I'm looking at condos and I'm like, well, if I can't have my own, I won't buy there.
Yeah, in fact, I'm visiting my older daughter this weekend on the way to a RecCon, and she and her wife just bought they had a hybrid. They needed a second car. They bought a Volt, and she just last week had the electrician install the charger in their house. So in the single family home world, that's a little easier to predict because that's just going to happen. And pretty soon, like when they go to sell that house, it's going to be more valuable because it has the charger. Mm-hmm. Although it'll be interesting again as chargers get better and faster. Like how many years before somebody else has a better one, and now they either have to upgrade or they're faced with actually it's worth less because their charger's not as fast as the other one. To do that at scale on the apartment side, that's an even bigger challenge. Yeah. Like I said, I can state the problem better than I can give you a solution right now.
Any other questions? Thank you, Shirley.
Where are you located, Shirley?
I'm in Alexandria, Virginia.
Okay, yeah. So DC sub. I grew up in Bowie.
Oh, okay,
So
cool.
like, yeah, when I said DC, I was thinking of like Arlington and then Montgomery County and Alexandria, exactly that area. So I think you're going to be on the cutting edge there.
If anyone, okay, I'll just jump in. So Donald, this is Corwin. And when you were back in your first topic on centralization, and you were mentioning about, the main drivers that they would need some,
Uh,
I'll just use centralization as like in the maintenance area. Now, when we're
yeah,
talking about multifamily here, we're
yeah.
just talking multifamily rentals. Is that correct?
Well, I mean,
Because,
my experience is multifamily rentals. I mean, in the
yeah,
for sale side, the for sale side, residents are kind of responsible for their own maintenance
correct,
or hiring people.
correct,
Typically, I mean, there's obviously a super is somebody who's handling like the boiler room or the big
right,
common area stuff.
right.
That's usually contracted out as well. So my comments were all around were definitely multifamily rental.
Okay, gotcha. Because I'm in a 38 unit like boutique condo building, and one of the
Yeah,
issues I've been having is when obviously where it's not common area stuff.
yeah,
Okay, like I got to go find someone for this. I got to find. I understand that being in a single family home, but
yeah,
in certain cases, the things that I'm responsible for is still kind of infrastructure, and it's just like,
yeah,
well, wait a minute, this is kind
yeah.
of an infrastructure
Well,
thing like the floor or whatever. I know
yeah,
yeah. So it's just like, okay, well, who do I go to? Because I don't know what the building uses and they don't disclose it. And, I have to run
yeah.
around to different people. So I would
Well,
like to see a solution in terms of the maintenance area and maintenance perspective for a condo building,
yeah.
in terms of
Well, and
owners.
that's interesting. I mean, that's somewhat analogous even to I was talking about the asset protection, right?
Hmm.
Like a Happy Co as an example where you can you can store all that information because the truth of the matter is you'd be surprised at how many apartment owners don't know that same information because the
Mm,
builder built it and somebody else bought it, and then somebody else bought it. Now I own it. And I mean, like, okay, we did due diligence around the quality, but we didn't write down carpet specs or write down, a lot of things that the original owner knew, and so it the one of the dirty secrets in large multifamily is how little they know about the details of their asset, right? They know what they paid, they know the cap rate, they know the unit counts, they maybe even know something on a high rise, they individual things. Um, you know, it's an awful lot of data to manage, and it wasn't stored anywhere.
yep.
And so that's where solutions like Leonardo 24/7 and HappyCo are trying to help sort of gather once, store forever kind of solutions.
And especially in my building, which was once an industrial factory from the 1920s, and they
Oh God.
reinvented, so they have no, it's like a lot of that lost data, like you say, because they weren't capturing it during that
Yep.
time. But yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we have a
Absolutely.
question from Marlene. Marlena?
Yes, thank you so much, Corwin and Mr. Donald, for such a great presentation. I'm like Corwin right there. I'm like, yeah, great presentation. How would I remember all of that? Anyhow, but it's good.
We
It was good.
recorded it so you can listen again.
Yep.
Exactly, right? Okay, the question that I have, not so much of a question, but it's almost like um, a subject that topic that I don't think you mentioned in regards to what we have, for example, right now in Florida. Recently was instituted that in the state, mandated by the state of Florida, that multifamilies that are, vertical and all that, because of the situation that went on in Miami collapsing, now is
Yep.
mandatory to have all the structural inspections and all that, of, in
Yeah.
order and all that,
Yeah.
for insurance purposes. Have
Yeah.
you learned anything new about that and how that would affect the future of the multifamily?
Yeah.
Uh,
I mean,
Is there
again, I
anything
think
like that you can share with us? Mhm.
yeah, I mean, when you say that, and that is not my area of expertise, I'm a little more front of house. in my world. So I'll share what I do know. When I hear you talk about things like that, that is where the risk management and asset protection comes in. So for example, let me even just use a normal garden community example where, in the summer, I'm supposed to do my pool pH checks, every other day or whatever the frequency is. And then I'm supposed to do a once a month walk to, look for, light outages in the parking lot for security reasons, et cetera. There's a real challenge with, if I'm running a large portfolio, how do I know that my team is actually doing those activities? And that was the inspiration for Leonardo 24/7, where basically you can load daily, weekly, monthly, annual requirements. And it's like a tickler system where, the community manager or the service manager gets reminded of something. And then they check off that they did it, et cetera. So you build a history. It ensures proactively things are done. It gives you some liability protection to show that proof that they were done, et cetera. Now, when you get into the details of like high-end engineering reviews, that may be a little bit outside the kind of technology that I'm talking about. But if it is something that like once every 3 years, something's required to be done or something's required to be done annually, tools like that can make sure, hey, did I engage an engineering company to go do this once every 3-year inspection? Because stuff that's supposed to happen every day, easy for a human to keep track of. I know if I took my pills this morning or not. Something I'm supposed to do monthly, pretty easy to forget a month went by. Stuff that I'm supposed to do every 3 years or every 5 years or every whatever, there's no way a human's going to remember that. So having a system that'll remind you is I think one of the places where technology can help. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it does. Absolutely. I love that. Definitely. Just like a traffic report, which I call, to my daily activities to know when, what, how, daylines and all. But now also in regards to how those potential assessments of things that would happen in those buildings, how would that affect the HOA fees and all of that? Because that's ultimately going to affect the budget, and the investors and whether they make a decision in buying there or not. So that's also another area that I feel that is so up in the air.
I'm sure there's some software or tracking systems, assessment systems in that area. I'm just not as personally familiar with. So I think we're right at 2:00. I know I've got another meeting I got to go to in a minute or so.
Yep.
Yeah, if there are any other questions, feel free to email me. Corin's got my email address as well. It's just D Davidoff. So first initial, last name at getreba.com. Probably should have had a slide with that. Yep. But yeah, Davidoff at getreba.com. Feel free to shoot me an email if you have a question I didn't get to, and I'm happy to answer that. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
I'd like to thank our guests. Thank you, Donald. I appreciate you taking your time and presenting these informative topic areas. So thank you all for your participation as well. And we'll see you at the next Tech in 30.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao, ciao.